Hi, welcome to Jesuit Missions podcast. I'm Francisca, and today we are journeying with Pedro Walpole.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Among other things, Pedro is a Jesuit priest, global coordinator for Eco Jesuit, and the research director for the Environmental Science for Social Change. Living in the Philippines, he works in sustainable environments and community land management with local communities, universities, international organizations, and governments. He will tell us everything about it today and will also talk about COPs. Pedro has attended many COPs, will tell us what we can expect from the next one, COP27, which will take place in Africa, Egypt in November. But first, let's begin with how you got involved in climate action. How did you get started?
Long time. I suppose I started when I was a child with the city council. I grew up on the Shannon River, and I was concerned that we had places for corncrakes and playing fields. So that's where I began, and my life actually was along the Shannon River, and I used to do some market gardening as a youth when I went to school. I then left. I wanted to work with Gerald Durrell in Guernsey, but it wasn't a good time, so I worked in Whipsonade Zoo. I saw many of the problems there, both inside and outside, in terms of the challenges in caring for the environment. I then worked in Rothamsted Experimental Station, which was an agricultural institute in Britain, one of the oldest ones. And I worked on nematodes, plant nematodes. So I spent a summer measuring sphagnum mosses and glacial melt in Iceland, in one of the glaciers there. So that got us aware of the problems that there was. At least I became aware of the problems of melt, and we didn't fully understand why at that stage. Though actually the knowledge existed for 20 years before that. In the 50s, it was very clear. So after the Iceland experience, which was quite freezing, I looked for somewhere warmer, and I ended up in Sabah. So I worked in Sabah on animal diseases, diagnostic lab for animal diseases, and I moved on to the national parks there and worked basically with geographic elevational evolution, if you like, how species adapt to elevation. It was a beautiful experience. I worked in Beaufort in the swamps and in Silporna in the coral reefs. And I met many of the displaced people from the Philippines, from Tawi-Tawi and Hilo. So I traveled on their boats back and forth to the Philippines. And I saw people really doing good work in Mindanao. That's the southern island there in the Philippines. Very beautiful, but many challenges. And that's where I saw a lot of social engagement of the Jesuits, a lot of interest in the condition of people on the land. So that's actually where I entered the Jesuits. So I came by way of the migrants and entered the Jesuits in the Philippines. And I suppose for the last 30 years, I've been here in Mindanao, working with indigenous peoples, trying to look at how they want to respond to the land, to the environment, their humble caring of life and of neighbor.
a long journey. And one part of that journey was attending the climate change conferences, right? The COP27 is coming up in about a month in Africa. Based on your experience, Pedro, what can we expect?
I think, number one, we have to be very realistic. The COP process is a universal process, and the United Nations, in one sense, is anything but united at the moment. There are pressures uniting it, but there are pressures pulling it apart. So the COP process, yes, this is number 27, and I was involved in the 1992 meetings, the pre-COP meetings. And it's really trying to get consensus. And remember, the Copenhagen COP failed precisely because it was trying to pressure. And that's where we came up with nationally determined commitments. Yeah, and everybody agreed to that process. That was COP 15. Yeah, COP 21, we got to the Paris Agreement. So we were willing to share a certain idealism. Yeah, and I won't say tip the balance in any sense, but that's also when Laudato Si came out.
Yes.
It came out just before COP. It helped people with a deeper, heartfelt experience. I think people could relate to the spirituality that was within them and with the land and the environment. So there was also great social participation in that. We have sort of pulled the plug on COP21. Nobody and not together is everybody committed to do something. Perhaps one of the poorest ones again, if Copenhagen failed for a short time, then Glasgow failed.
You think so?
Because
why?
Yes. Look at the concessions to coal that came in, on the last day. That was really, a turn within the system that was not transparent. Now we have even negotiations today. Yeah. So we have to keep pushing. We have to get the realities out there, because actually the difference today is that people are much more conscious that climate change is here and it's getting worse. We haven't yet connected to the millions of poor people who are actually suffering climate change. Yeah, you might experience a disruption in public transport. You might experience a delay that might be due to climate events elsewhere, unbeknownst to us. But actually today now, we are seeing how this is connected. And we need to see how people are part of this. We're part of the problem. We are the problem. We are the answer. And I say to this, technology is not the answer. Getting a carbon sucker into the environment is not going to solve the carbon figures.
It has to be a more personal transformation, do you think so?
Yes, a more personal, a more social transformation. There has to be a willingness. And we also need to get a political accountability in this. Because while individuals and families and everything else may be willing to make adaptations and simplify their lifestyle, which has happened a little through COP, we now have the extremities arising of very hot summer in your country and a cold winter. This means energy. Yeah. And precisely because we haven't been paying attention to all the bits and pieces, we now have problems right across Europe. In terms of gas and oil and food grains, and everything is coming in at the same time. because we're not really reflecting on our context. We seem to be reflecting on our political wishfulness and divisiveness in political dynamics around the world. And we really need to start to work together.
But Pedro, in your opinion, what is the role of civil society in this? Because sometimes people feel they can't do much. What are your thoughts on that? So you think civil society can play a part?
But first, I'd ask you to examine civil society. Where is civil society today? It's much less than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Civil society has become like a condominium. Yeah, you live a privatized life. You go as a professional to work, and you can separate or you can connect as you want to, but you actually don't have a community. This is why often it's a part of the dynamic of both parents working, because they don't have a community around them anymore. Both parents working professionally, coming back, trying to hold a family together. And, you know, the economists have us on the treadmill. We have to keep making money in order to keep the children in school, in order to cover all of the other expenses. Look at housing costs, everything else. So actually, it's broken down civil society.
Can we learn something? Can we learn something from the indigenous communities that you work with?
Well, to organize civil society, you need democracy. Yeah. Now, that's a shifting thing these days. Yeah. And you need responsibility by how the civil society is organized. If it's organized according to political parties, that becomes very divisive. So we do need civil society. We do have to come down out of our condominiums, from our different segregated places, and actually talk together and work together. So that's the value of people creating what I call a social cloud around the COP. Okay, yes, we spend for airfares going there and we add to the carbon and we're part of the problem, but we have to get talking. And there are times for face-to-face, and COP is a time for face-to-face. Now, we also need to get much greater communication going as we gather around these selected negotiators, and every 5 years or so when we get the heads of state coming together. So we have to focus on COP30. And we have to use this COP27. 28 will be in the United Arab Republic, Emirate.
Emirate, yeah.
And the 29th will probably be in Eastern Europe, and then some great world power will honor COP30, where all the heads of state will come. We're used to this sort of thing. Now, COP30 is crucial because we need a major social engagement in there, and we are going to see transformations, and the youth are going to make the difference. We really need to get and support the youth from any angle possible, and to connect them across the world to make this difference and to have their voices. This is essential, and we have to really move for, in this COP, loss and damages. I'll come back to that in a minute, but we have to start helping people recover from the disasters of this year alone. Pakistan, Mali, Somalia, sometimes it's tied up with a war situation, migration, all of these things, slow-moving droughts, yeah, are really driving people off of the land. So there were a list of 6, and number 1 of those is loss and damages. So this COP has got to address that, and I think it will fail if it doesn't give a clear response. And the $100 billion is nothing in terms of what we're going to have to spend.
Mm-hmm.
in one of these major disasters, we spend that already. I don't know what it'll cost for Pakistan to hold people together and communities and rebuild the lives that have been lost. It's like one massive war explosion in Pakistan at the moment. So that's what we have to address in COP. Key in this is the youth develop the ability to enter into negotiation and to structure this. We have to get a voice. So my sense is between now and COP30, we need to start to form social venues for discussing the COP, and not just virtual, and being able to have an impact on our national society as well as the global.
But
So,
do you think...
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
So I'm saying the points that have to be negotiated, the youth have to get in there, form a new communication. This will be the new civil society, being able to mix social media and venue. But the venues are important. Now, coming into this, and what was very good in Glasgow is we had a better representation of indigenous peoples. Yeah. You know, Francesca, what we're talking about here is integrity. Okay? The youth have integrity. Indigenous peoples have integrity. And we need to make sure our negotiators and the heads of state have an integrity as they deal with this common global problem. So indigenous peoples, they're not going to have the answer for, 9 billion people. What they're going to have is the experience of working with the sea or with the land, and what right relationship is. And we have to listen to them, not walk over them. And what we're doing at the moment with economic expansion, roads everywhere, massive fishing, mining, both in the ocean and everywhere else, we're just extracting all around them and breaking down their social cohesion, their cultural cohesion.
Do you think that the COP being held in Africa, do you think that adds a special dimension, or do you think it won't make really a difference?
COP22 was in Africa. It was hardly heard of.
Okay.
Okay, this is Egypt, which is, yes, Africa, but the edge of Africa. And that Egypt welcomes Africa and gives a platform to Africa to speak, that's most important. And the Jesuits in Africa are organizing, very small, but they are part of that. They're collaborating with an African voice. And that's what we need. And we need this, in a sense, I really feel, led with the integrity of the youth. The integrity of the youth, they don't have a bank account, they probably have a loan. They're not in there for what they can make out of this. They're in there because their hearts are bleeding. And they've got to understand that they are not the problem. It's the world that is the problem, our present context, and we have to address that. So don't get choked up here because everything's going wrong. It's not the fault of the youth, but we need the energy of the youth and the love of the youth to go out there and change this. This is what the spirituality of it is. We've lost our human nature. It's as if everything is defined by the dollar, but it's defined by our own life and our own dreams. And these are very real. They're not to be brushed aside. And we don't have an adequate process for listening to this. Sorry, came back the other month from the United Nations Conference on the Oceans. It was a very good experience for those of us who gathered around it. But when we were, some of our group, our delegation was allowed to speak to the representatives and everything else. Basically, the hall was 80% empty. Everybody had gone. Nobody was listening. The value of it is it goes into the record. Yeah.
And step by step.
Yeah. But we have to be more strategic. Now, so what we did in the United Nations Conference on the Oceans was we also gathered the faith dynamic there. And we talked with a bunch of the religious groups that were around and with the Catholic Church in general in Lisbon. We had some very good reception, and they didn't realize this was happening. So it's always important to get rooted locally. We talked in some of the local schools. Pedro Walpole school invited us. That was wonderful. And now, as we prepare for the COP15 on biodiversity in Montreal later this year in December, we now have a space allotted for faith-based groups, yeah, and for indigenous groups. Yeah, these are important. And the youth needs to be able to, yeah, have their stand. I mean, they were outside the ocean event, you know, dressed up as sharks and dressed up as, yeah, various animals that are just being lost from the oceans. And the reception was not good by the system. We need, a respect for youth expression and the marches. I don't expect there will be too much open space in this present COP. Socially, the way it's structured on the southern end of Egypt and how it's organized, it will be difficult. And the same for the next COP. But we have to start to create voices, whether we do that nationally at the same time in order to create a lobby, we've got to look ways. And we've always got to include the marginalized. There's marginalized in every country, yeah? They have to be given the voice. And for me, what is very important in this are the women. We're just losing out so much by not listening to the women. Here, I live in the mountains here. Yeah. Yeah, it's very beautiful. It's lovely and green, and it's terrible. It's terrible because we are being forced economically to grow animal feeds, and we don't have enough human feeds. When there's a disaster, we have nothing to buy any food with. So we're feeding pigs and chickens in the lowlands around the plateau, and people are eating poison corn grains, yeah, that upset their stomachs and turn them off because stuff has been grown on glyphosate land. And we've been doing interviews with communities and listening to people here, and it's the women who are changing that. The women are saying, we need yung consumo muna. We have to look at what our daily consumable food is. We need to bring that back.
Yeah. So you think the key are so the youth, the women, and marginalized people.
Yeah, they have an insight that we don't have in the straightforward economics of this. Yeah. So these voices need to be heard, and they need to be heard within the negotiations, and others need to be accountable to them. Yeah. They've got to look the negotiators in the eye and ask them, what are you doing for the common good?
Pedro, thank you so much for your time. It was really inspiring talking to you today. Hope you continue developing your work in the Philippines. And thanks to you who just listened to our podcast. If you want to stay up to date, just follow us on our social media. This podcast is available across all platforms.